Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Rome 451, Law in a Transformative Age, our executive webinar with a 45-minute format in which we discuss complex topics with distinguished guests. As those who follow us already know, the format provides a focus on two aspects on one topic that I introduce and guests will debate on. First point concerns the analysis, the second, possible solutions. Today's topic is international organizations and systemic crises. Our guests are Larry Catà, professor of law and international affairs at Penn State University, a prominent comparative, corporate, international, and transnational law scholar, and Susanna, professor of European Union law at the University of Salento, a tireless animator of the movement of supranational democracy. We move on from the following point. There are so many international organizations at stage, but at every crisis, whether financial, pandemic, or climatic, states are forced to improvise because there are no protocols, no mechanisms for sharing choices. In some cases, new organizations are created to face the crisis at hand. For example, in Europe, the 2008 financial crisis produced the banking union. The cyclical nature of systemic crisis, environmental, financial, health, or food pandemic, whose unit of measurement is now the decade, no longer the century, has shown the failure of regulatory systems that have privileged the complexity of managing physiology, market regulation, for example, rather than the speed of the reaction to the pathology, systemic shocks. The consequence is that the typical tools of collective emergency are not among the endowments of international organizations, not even those more recent, less rigid in terms of institutions and delegated powers. The question is why? For example, in the European Union, following the food pandemic at the end of the last century, Metcal, we have set up a European Food Safety Agency and the rapid alert and intervention system that identifies the outbreak, isolates it, suspends the free movement of goods, checks all products from the infected farm thanks to the tracing of the supply chain. This system has made it possible to prevent at least 4 major food epidemics in the past 20 years in Europe. We do not have a European agency with similar powers for health epidemics. However, the European Union has competences to do that. It does not appear the member states are ready to allow it, but the lack of coordination reduces the efficacy of the intervention, as we see, unfortunately. But also international European agencies are coordinated with the World Health Organization, but act in the absence of binding protocols. We are all experiencing the consequences. The technological revolution is a second focus of perspective, because we are seeing how national governments are not independent of big data corporations, which even impose standards, decentralized, for example, that of the application for tracing, to which states and international organizations must adapt. In other words, in today's international law, states look like islands with no connections, and Apple, Google, Facebook, Twitter become bridges. Larry, Susanna, I don't know if you agree with this pattern. Larry.
Hi, everyone. And thank you so much, Professor Bassan, for having me on. I do agree. And I think we're in a very interesting time. And it's a time where institutional incapacity is being exposed. And it's being exposed primarily because of the confluence of factors that I think no one anticipated would actually occur simultaneously. And what I want to do is perhaps talk to 5 critical challenges. You mentioned an important one, and that is the which would be a 6th, of course, which would be the contest for control and authority between the state and the public state that we know of, and then these private entities that are assuming more and more state-like powers. But I want to go within the agencies to talk a little bit about the reasons for their incapacity. And like I said, I've got 5 for you. The first, I think, deals with their institutional cultures. Most of these international agencies, especially ones with very large secretariats and large pools of employees worldwide, have been cultivating cultures, administrative cultures, bureaucratic cultures that tend to be risk averse and that tend to focus on jurisdiction preserving and jurisdiction expanding modalities. So you've got an institutional culture that is not prepared for crisis, but that is instead prepared for the kind of expansion you would expect to see in ministries, for example. The second one, I think, are the challenges of the institutional core functions. Most of these organizations were set up to create facts. They're based on statistics. I'm reminded of Michel Foucault's notions, of course, of statistics now becoming the new law, but I'll put that aside for the moment. But they're statistics-making organizations. They create narrative, they create facts, they coordinate. They do not act. They act to create the space within which they can effectively justify themselves and coordinate and create the realities around which they can continue to function. The third is the state politics, which is projected into institutions. We all know, of course, that it blows up periodically. The US-China projection of their own contest in the context of the World Health Organization is a very real one. And the constant problem of state projection into the Human Rights Council in Geneva, of course, is another. So you've got institutional cultural constraints, you've got institutional core function constraints, you've got the projection into these institutions of interstate politics. You also have hierarchies of state power reflected in the priorities and practices of some of these organizations. Again, I'll focus on who people forget, except in the Middle East, the anger of some states about, for example, whose response to the MERS crisis. Things get prioritized in particular ways that reflect state power that tend to put developing states down towards the bottom of anyone's interest, except for photo opportunities when, of course, you have the requisite number of people show up. But that makes people even angrier. And then the last, of course, is that as an autonomous bureau, it also seeks to protect its own space. So the primary challenge of these institutions is that they tend to construct an inherent conservatism grounded in self-preservation. And you look at who, for example, who trumpets that they create themselves, the sense of themselves working with influencers, providing access to academics. We love it. But it does tend to focus them on those kinds of things. And when institutions that are culturally created and contextually operated within these 5 challenges face these emergencies, these crises, they tend to operate true to form, which is institutionally conservative, focusing on the projection of their core functions, accelerating and augmenting interstate politics, acting on the basis of these hierarchies of politics and working towards self-preservations in ways that then tend to detract from their ability to actually shape or work through a crisis rather than to preserve, to act in an augmented way, to act like they've always acted.
Thank you, Larry, for your explanation. Is very comprehensive. Susanna.
Thank you, Fabio. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation and also for the topic. I really love this topic. I think we have a lot to rebuild in the international organizations law because for 2 reasons, essentially. First, because we live in an incredibly interconnected world. And this is a world that couldn't even be imagined 20 years ago, or just imagine 50 years ago or 60 years ago when most of the organizations were created. The UN is turning 75, so you can measure the difference between their reality and our reality. And we live in a world which is exposed to huge dramatic accidents or risks that were beyond our imagination some years ago. And I just want to mention financial crisis. The pandemic is another perfect example, and couldn't be maybe the last one. We hope so, but we don't know. We live in a situation where, because of the raising of temperatures, we have extreme weather events, and this is also a major issue. And second, all these events are connected. All these occurrences may be interconnected, because other global issues such as migrations or risks of threats to peace or inequalities, rising inequalities, are all connected to these issues, which are unexpected, global, and subject to very fast contagion because of our interconnectedness. So we have old organizations which do not take into consideration our interconnectedness, and they have competences which are attributed by charters, which were written a lot of time ago, and can be changed only with unanimous decisions, often of very high majorities. So they are quite rigid to the change. And what happens is that we tend to imagine solutions, pieces of solutions. So sectoral solutions, the agencies, very narrow treaties or commitments, without taking in account all these interconnectedness, not only of populations, but also of issues. So I definitely agree that we need to rethink our system of international organization in the light of imagining broader attributions of competencies, much increased coordination, and the other focal point, I think, is legitimacy. We don't have many coordination bodies or fora where really all the issues can be managed in an interrelated way. We can mention the G20, which has huge legitimacy problems. We can also mention the Economic and Social Council in the UN, which is in a sense coordinating the action of all the UN agencies, but doesn't have real effective powers. So it's really, pour parler is not really a place for bold solutions. So there is a lot to do on the side of attribution of competencies, on the side of coordination, and on the side of legitimacy. So this is the let's say the critical part of my contribution. And of course, I will have more to add on the other side of what we can do to improve this state of situation. Yeah. This part.
Thanks, Susanna. Let's go to the dark side, the second part, modest proposals. What can we do? This is the question. My proposal is a solution that would improve international relations and would require a minimum effort of coordination between states without a further transfer of sovereignty. It is clear that the most significant gap, in my opinion, on the level of international economic organizations is that of a collective reaction to systemic crisis. That's clear. The systemic nature is precisely the innovative element of the crisis we had to face in the last 30 years. And so it will be reasonably for the future, for the next future. It is also evident, at least to me, that however systemic, crises are never symmetrical because they do not produce similar effects in all states, depending to a large extent on the conditions in which each state finds itself at the time the crisis occurs. It is also demonstrated by the practice of the last 30 years that states consider systemic crisis a challenge and an opportunity in a ruthless competition not only between companies and markets, but also between legal systems and between states, which in the dynamic of international relations now devoted to market power, transform this power into political supremacy. If these are the facts that cannot be ignored, the solution to choose must be identified according to a principle of proportionality among those that minimize the cost for the states in terms of transfer of sovereignty and reduction of competition between legal systems and between states in dealing with the crisis, but at the same time allow to coordinate the reaction to systemic crisis. And this is the point. Systemic crises have different origins, nature, for example, economic, financial, health, climatic, and require a fast reaction, often taken in the absence of historical series, and therefore certainty about the efficacy of the tools adopted. Unconventional measures are now the standard answer. What is needed and which is missing today, in my opinion, is an international organization that performs functions of coordination of national actions in the immediacy of the crisis, in its management, and in the phase of overcoming and rebuilding. Given the nature, origin, and different features of the crisis, this organization should be equipped with internal and operational bureaus suitable for early warning functions and with the power to direct and coordinate the actions of the states that are part of it. Just the variety of threats to react to does not allow the organization to be given adequate scientific structures to deal with health, financial, and climatic events from time to time, nor it is conceivable to believe that states are ready to delegate such a large part of sovereignty. At the same time, however, this structuring of the actions, such as that of current summits, G20 or G11 of all, is not enough, since it is not suitable for an immediate action. Furthermore, the G mechanism is not compatible with the generally universal and open nature of such an organization. Given the wide spectrum of action, the organization should have decision-making bodies with a variable composition, similar to what happens, for example, for the Council of the European Union. The bodies will be made up of heads of state or government, as for the G summits, or ministers responsible for the health, environment from time to time due to the origin of the crisis. The decisions will consist in coordinating the actions of national governments. They should be adopted with qualified majorities, but not allowing a single state to have a veto power. They will not be binding, but would constitute a top law that would act as a benchmark. The decisions of this organization should consist in identifying ways and forms of coordinated reaction to critical events, as simple as that. They should also integrate collective assistance for countries that are unable to act in accordance with the decision taken due to the lack of funding or structures. I do believe that this method could integrate the use of existing economic institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, among all, because collective assistance is to be preferred over that of individual states, which would lead to significant geopolitical consequences. Not thinking of China. A permanent link would also be desirable with institutions capable of supplying and processing data, practices, and protocols. Institutions and or companies, of course. I do believe this solution is more immediate and simplified than the alternative one, to give existing organizations adequate scale to manage crises. Firstly, because we have seen the critical issues of many of these organizations, as for the functioning, decision-making power, which affect their legitimacy and accountability. Secondly, because such changes would require a significant number of negotiations, which would also risk getting bogged down on a series of issues that have nothing to do with the needs and gaps emerged with recent practice. I guess Susanna will have something to say about it.
Yes, a lot to say, actually.
Please go.
I like your proposal, definitely. And I think there is a lot to do in order to enforce such a, it would be a real paradigm change, I think. And the big paradigm change is really moving from a society, a community of sovereign states living in a competitive mode, in a competitive approach, to a cooperative approach, at least, as you say, when there is a problem of crisis management, as the facts are showing that we are all in the same boat in the end. When there is a real crisis, even if it is asymmetric, it's a damage for most of the actors, for the largest majority. The difficulty will be to build such a broad consensus in order to have a critical mass of states subscribing to the proposal and accepting this limitation of sovereignty. Unfortunately, there is this disconnect between, I think, the reality of the fact that sovereignty is, in many cases, I wouldn't say an empty shell, but enough empty shell, as states are so much affected by what other states do and by market forces at global level that they are not so sovereign as they assume to be, or they say to their citizens that they are. So they should just, let's say, take the reality for what it is and explain to the citizens that they don't need to have this formal sovereignty if this doesn't allow them to do the best for their citizens. So we need a win-win procedure, which is a negotiating procedure aimed at the collective good, and we need a cooperative approach. And then we need legitimacy in the top political decisional bodies. And yes, I saw a comment stating we need the majority. Yes, we need the majority in the decision-making process. Of course, we can imagine this majority as a large majority, as a majority of states and population. We can invent the right majority, but we should avoid at any cost a veto power of anybody, because this just makes a negotiation impossible if somebody knows that he can block any decision. So, and another point I really agree upon is the need to move from a simple multilateralism to a multi-stakeholder model, because states are not the only actors on the scene, and often they are not even the most powerful one. At least small states are not the most powerful actors on the scene. And some big companies are more relevant for reaching a global result than some small states, for instance. And I would love to add a further level, which is civil society. We need, in a multi-stakeholder model, also to take into account the voice of associated citizens, because it's difficult to imagine a real legitimate system with a global vote or this kind of national legitimacy procedures, but we can imagine a system where there is a civil society at the table, a big interest, a big diffused interest represented in some way. And we need also that people participate in this system as part of this civil society. So we need an increase in civic participation. I think we need a culture of global citizenship in a sense. So people assuming their responsibilities not only for national politics, but also for a global public sphere, which is getting more and more relevant. And so this would make more significant the presence of civil society if there is more participation from bottom up, let's say. So, and yes, a new organization could be the solution. The alternative solution, I don't know if it's more feasible or easier, would be to reform the existing organizations. There are just a couple of organizations I would like to mention. Of course, they are difficult to modify, but they should be or are supposed to be organizations able to manage crises. One is the UN, and I remember some years ago an interesting proposal by Stiglitz and Docampo to add a new council to the Security Council as a Global Economic Coordination Council. That could be another way to have a global political stance with not everybody in the room, because it's impossible to take decisions with 190 states with a reduced number, but a reduced number elected by all, and possibly with those additions to other stakeholders, and in charge with crisis and systemic crisis and extreme weather events or pandemic or financial crisis, and this would be one solution. You know, there is a big campaign to change the UN, make it more democratic and more participative. And another solution would be to intervene on the IMF, which is the other subject, the other organization in charge with crisis in a sense. But unfortunately, it's not the IMF, which was imagined in the 1944, because now is more micromanaging than really managing the big systemic crisis. Is more focused on state crisis than on the global scene. And there too, I see the need for a big restructuring, because the decisional body is the governing council with all the ministers of the world, which of course cannot decide anything, there are just too many, and an executive board with 24 people, which are appointed by the capitals of the more influential states. But they are officials, national officials, appointed for just 2 years, and so the least expected to take bold decisions as well. So we have a financial ministers, a committee made by 24 ministers, and they also represent all the others. So this could be the political body. Unfortunately, it's just an advisory body. So this kind of body, small like the G20, but representing all the others not in the room, could be another kind of solution. But I like the idea of a coordination, or an horizontal coordination for all the crisis management. That would be a big improvement. I only am a bit discouraged by the difficulty to bring at the table many states in order to make it effective. But on the principle, I'm with you.
Thank you, Susanna, also for opening up the discussion to the supranational democratic principles. Larry, as usual, you get the last word.
Oh no, that's always a dangerous thing. All right, thank you very much. The discussion has been just quite remarkable and quite useful. And I think that if we look at your proposal, especially in the context in which Susanna then explores, we have an excellent approach if you start from the perspective that you're going to take what you have now and you make it better. What I'd like to do as I discuss that is to situate the proposal within a universe of culturally contingent proposals, which may also be plausible, but which may reflect other approaches and other cultural approaches to political solutions to the issue of multilateral crisis management. And I just want to go through them briefly, situate yours within it, and then suggest the extent to which we're looking at not theoretical plausibility, but we're looking at perhaps political feasibility. And the answer may well be that at this moment in time, there may be very little political feasibility for anything. And so we're stuck with what we have. So let me start with, and I've got 5 approaches. 3 of them are approaches related to reality, and then 2 of them are sort of the ones that I build off of what we see. The first one is what I'll call the American solution. That's a misnomer. It's not just the Americans. And the idea is here, the idea is that we have to abandon the current system. Effectively, you tear the house down to rebuild it. It suits the time. It suits the American cultural experience. And usually one can say, well, who cares what a country says? But if it's a disproportionately influential country, then one has to pay attention. And right now, the Americans are going through a period of trauma, and one in which they're indulging this sense of the need to tear things down and to rebuild them. But in this case, to rebuild them on an America First model, to focus on bilateralism, aggregated bilateralism, and to essentially just empty out the international organizations and to use them just as pots where on occasion, perhaps during crises, the aggregated bilateralism of an America First model can then be used to coordinate through these agencies. So that's a possible approach. The upside, of course, for those who are really focused on public law and public sovereignty, this really goes back to that old model in ways that allows coordination. It smells a little bit of the world between 1919 and 1939, and that sort of worked. It sort of didn't work, and people, of course, will say, as they said in 1945, those who lost the debate then, well, they just didn't do it right, and we can rebuild it better. The second solution, in which your model fits beautifully, and in fact, probably it's the most thoughtful approach on the basis of that model that I have heard, is what I call the EU solution. And this is, in a sense, institutional and bureaucratic. It calls for modifications that reflect core EU values, and core EU values are not anything that should be denigrated. These things have been powerful mechanisms for reshaping the way in which the world, public, private, transnational, and international, have been shaped. But these EU values and cultures then tend to serve as a basis for this solution: coordinated management, comitology, shared sovereignty, multi-shareholder model, shared culture, and mutual aid. And then the issue, when you take that as your cultural starting point, the issue then becomes not bureaucratic, but structural administrative, and one that builds on what we have now and then reshapes it. The third one, which is very different, is what I call the Chinese solution. So we've had an American solution, an EU solution, and a Chinese solution. The Chinese approach would be a hub and spoke model, right? So the EU is one of comitology, shared values, and coordination. The Americans are tear the house down and rebuild it on the basis of aggregated bilateralism. The Chinese solution is a hub and spoke model. And it's the organization as a coordinated space around key states. It's anchored in key states. As you recall, for example, when China talked about rethinking WHO's approach to pandemic, the idea was to build in key states as medical warehouses, for example, or as institutional warehouses of people or doctors and the like. And so what you have is a hub and spoke model, which reflects, in a sense, China's Belt and Road Initiative. You have key states that serve as the coordinating centers, from out of which everything else is then undertaken or implemented. And this is one can do this in a variety of ways, but in that context, of course, organizations like the WHO then serve as meeting points, the way squares in Europe used to serve as meeting points in the 9th or 10th century. You don't use them when you don't need them. The live stuff is in these hub states, and then everything else goes out. And those are the three models that are likely to be the ones that are most debated. My model is a very simple one, and it's based on the premise that, given what I've said before about the cultural embedding of IOs, the way they are necessarily built and operated within the narrative space we've created over the course of the last 50 years, that they're culturally incapable of responding to crisis. They are just culturally incapable. And if that's the case, then there are two possible approaches, or three possible approaches to reframing them. The first two are public law based. One of them is to reduce the role of IOs merely to capacity building, to the development of toolkits, to the accountability, to serve as centers for the accountability of states, to coordinate resource sharing, and to coordinate, but not to make decisions, all of which are left to states. All right, the second version of this is, rather than to do that, to effectively give vent to the secretariat culture of IOs as we understand them today. The second one would be a different one. It would be a quasi-administrative one, where IOs serve the purpose of establishing the broad baseline principles that could be enforced by the collective organization. It's an emergency management power that can be enforced, but triggered only by a vote of the majority of the membership of the organization. Here you've got them as basically quiet unless there's an emergency, and then they implement and hold accountable to these baselines. The last one, and I'll try to be very brief, is a private law solution, and no one's going to like this one. but it's there, and Professor Bassan opened the door by mentioning Apple and the large quasi-state enterprises. So I'm going to just jump in here, and that is to say we abandon it entirely. And that indeed, that the only solution to transnational and international crisis is not the IO, is not centering the solution on IOs, but instead to leave it to the market. That's solution number one, to leave it, I told you no one's gonna like this, right? To leave it to the market. The IO, like states in the context of competition law, sets out the boundaries of the scope of the market. They set out the rules of market conduct, but that actually pandemic, for example, or everything else will be based on and left to an interaction of private players in markets coordinated by IOs and then underneath them states. And then the last and probably the most radical one, the one that absolutely no one is going to like except engineers, I guess, is that we not only privatize it but we don't leave it to the market, we leave it to the algorithm. That is, that the only way to resolve crisis, to work crisis, is through big data management and AI. IOs then become the data harvesters into which you pour the data. Their secretariats are filled with modelers who do predictive analytics and who create predictive solutions and command that could either be commands or the like, but that all of this is ultimately only possible coordinated at the international level through AI-based, that is artificial intelligence-based, predictive and contemporary coordination based on analytics and fed by big data.
Thank you, Larry. I can't wait for the article you write about it. There is a question, Gianluca Rabitti, about a new regulatory system strictly based on majority, but with a chance of dissenters to pull out, but still contribute to a minor level of the organization for a fixed period. No more vetoes, but I need to work for consensus without state makers. Yeah, the solution is not an international law solution or a public international law solution or transnational one. The solution should be found in all the entire system. A system where there are states, international organizations, and private companies. We have seen how states have set up an international organization over the past 70 years to manage development, not to respond to crisis, and that's clear to us. International organizations are institutions that work with the sun, don't have a general umbrella. It is when it rains that we realize the limits of this system, and now it's raining a lot. Furthermore, new subjects now enter into international law. Big data multinationals, which sometimes negotiate the rules with states, sometimes impose them. It's a new framework, we should start to deal with it, so the differences between private international law, public international law, and transnational law are no longer in our system. So we'll do it in the next two webinars. Next Friday, we'll talk about international investment disputes and systemic crisis. We'll try to understand how contracts and treaties can help crisis management. With Maria Beatrice Deli, Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce, Italy, and Maria Chiara Malaguti, Professor of International Law at the Catholic University of Rome, as guests. And the last webinar, Friday 26th, will be focused on smart contracts and artificial intelligence. And Andrea Renda from CEPS Brussels and European Commission expert for digital revolution will be our guest. So we keep on studying on this new system among international, public international law, private international law, and transnational law. So thanks, Susanna and Larry, and see you all at the next webinar.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.